Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
And again, welcome to Overcoming Identity Challenges in Mergers and Acquisitions with Azure AD. My name is Chris Lloyd, and I'm the CTO of Oxford Computer Group. Before we start discussing the challenges with mergers and acquisitions, I'd like to give a short background on who Oxford is for those who don't know us. Oxford Computer Group has been an identity consultancy since Microsoft bought its first identity company in 2003 called Zoomit. Ever since then, we've been engaged in identity and security projects in and around the Microsoft landscape. A consistent theme that we've seen in many of these projects is that they have involved planning or solving identity challenges with mergers and acquisitions. So acquisitions and mergers present us with multiple challenges, and those organizations seem to have all sorts of identity challenges with those mergers and acquisitions. I'm not going to go through the entire list here, but I will highlight some of the more important ones, at least the ones that I think are important. But when two or more organizations attempt to merge, there are often difficulties in providing shared services. And this is where you'll start having discussions of Active Directory consolidations, mergers, or even a consolidation to an intermediate forest. But however, Active Directory mergers can take a very long time because there are many steps to do it properly. But in the meantime, the business still wants the two organizations to start leveraging shared resources and start to collaborate. If the acquired organization, the acquired organization may not have the same security standards as the parent, which can lead to inherent security vulnerabilities. And at the end of the day, the delay, confusing access methods, and downtime leads to serious user dissatisfaction and loss of productivity. So from IT's perspective, there are some huge challenges that are prohibitive to getting both organizations sharing these resources. And traditionally, they are left looking at costly AD migrations or standing up that intermediary forest I was talking about. And this often presents issues with fully leveraging Azure Active Directory. In the past, we used to, I got lost there. I already talked about the past, but this process usually leaves users with a broken single sign-on experience. And they're left waiting for IT to complete their tasks. There is a way to speed this up and get a good user experience by having a good identity strategy and leveraging some of the new Azure AD tools that were released at last year's Ignite. So before we jump into the how, I wanted to spend some time and talk about why we might want to use Azure AD for mergers and acquisitions. And Azure AD has multiple advantages versus on-premise Active Directory. So first and foremost, it's that it is an identity as a service. So there's no hardware or infrastructure to maintain. Now, in my list here, I've put integrated with Office 365 as a bullet point. And that's really an understatement. Azure AD is Office 365's identity repository. So if you've got Office 365, Azure AD is in the background already by design. B2B collaboration or the sharing of resources with external identities is built in too. And while you could make the acquired organization B2B users in the tenant, there might be a better way to do it, which we'll look at in just a little bit. Self-service password reset's a big one. It reduces help desk calls and allows users to basically manage their forgotten passwords. And the last two go hand in hand. Just like ADFS or Active Directory Federation Services is an identity provider and users can authenticate to Azure AD to gain access to their applications. Once this is configured, Azure AD gets to act like a security guard and analyze the state of the requests to the application session before permitting access. So when faced with a merger or acquisition, it may be challenging to inventory the applications, but once you have that inventory, you can easily check to see if the application is in the Azure gallery. And if it is, Microsoft has step-by-step guides for configuring these applications for single sign-on. If the application doesn't exist in the Azure AD gallery. Azure AD allows you to bring your own application. We could get into the weeds discussing all the various ways we can get applications configured to use Azure AD, but there are several different mechanisms. They're all standards-based. SAML's a big one. And when we engage in these type of migrations, we tend to talk to a lot of application owners and usually work with them to find the best strategy of authentication that the application can support that Azure AD offers. And this is kind of cool. This is a new trend that Microsoft spearheaded. It's where SaaS applications exist, and there's 50 plus apps right now that support this, but it has the ability to let Azure AD configure it for you. This is accomplished through a browser extension that is engaged when an administrator starts the process to configure single sign-on. The extension directs you to the SaaS application to sign in, and then actually enters all the information into the single sign-on configuration section of that specific application, which means that these applications can literally be set up in minutes. And for those not familiar with ADFS, and I always do my best to define acronyms when I'm giving a webinar, but ADFS is Active Directory Federation Services. It's essentially the on-premise single sign-on service in the Microsoft stack that first appeared as a downloadable feature in Windows Server, I think 2003 R2. And over my career, I've spent a lot of time with ADFS, and it pains me to have this slide up here, but it really is time to start really seriously considering getting off of ADFS. Azure AD is roughly 90%, in my opinion, it's 90% feature parity with what ADFS offers, and really there's basically about a 10% of edge cases that still require ADFS. And it wouldn't be a good webinar if I didn't have a poll question, and I'd love to see how many of you are running ADFS in your environment today. So I'll go ahead and launch that poll, if you wouldn't mind answering. Oh, it's a mix, guys. It's a mix. All right. Thanks for answering that. We're going to continue on. I appreciate it. So some of the challenges running ADFS in your environment are well known to many. And you must be concerned with maintaining ADFS on-premise infrastructure. An application integration can be painful, slow, and expensive sometimes with ADFS. ADFS farms must be patched, capacity must be planned out, and other infrastructure like load balancers and other redundancy tools are a requirement. Certificates must also be maintained and replaced when expired, and it must be monitored to ensure that it's functioning properly, although your users will probably let you know if it's not. And overall, it might not seem like it, but there's a really big cost to running ADFS. And what I have up here on the screen here is Microsoft's attempt, and it's a pretty good one, which will basically allow you to, and this is through Azure Active Directory Connect Health running on your ADFS farm, that allows it to get information back on all the different applications that are configured with ADFS. And it shows you where they will migrate over and what things might need to be changed or taken into consideration. So it's a really good report, and this is just going to come by default if you're running Azure AD Connect Health on your ADFS servers. You have access to this information within the Azure portal. So go ahead and check it out. You can get a rough idea of the order of magnitude that you're looking at to migrate these applications from ADFS to Azure Active Directory. And doing a migration from Azure AD to ADFS can be done and should be done in a phased approach. Migrations can be pretty transparent to the end user, and there are mechanisms for the migration of cloud applications and on-premise applications and VPN services. We, as Oxford Computer Group, do this quite frequently, and we have a pretty good methodology and process that allows organizations to transition away from ADFS, Okta, or even another single sign-on service that are out there. So when you transition to when you transition to Azure AD from ADFS, not only do you alleviate all of the ADFS baggage, but you can actually enhance security. While ADFS has some components of conditional access through claim rule customization, Azure AD has conditional access built right in that leverages all the sensory inputs that the Microsoft Security Graph receives. When a user signs into Azure Active Directory, the location, the device compliance, and the application being accessed are all evaluated before deciding on whether the user is granted access. Additionally, with Azure Identity Protection, advanced data can be analyzed for more details about the user behavior. This is just like a credit card company where they're monitoring for fraudulent and risky transactions. This system looks for impossible travel, sign-ins from infected devices, sign-ins from anonymous IP addresses, and many other sensory inputs that are coming off of that security graph. These inputs will generate what we can basically say is a user risk score. And it can be used to challenge a user for MFA. You can actually set it up to limit access within the application that they're accessing, or you can entirely block access if it's too risky for your environment. So once you have those applications transition to Azure AD, and you are faced with a merger and/or acquisition, your goal will be getting those identities into Azure AD. And historically, this has been a bit cumbersome. But with Azure AD Connect cloud provisioning, it's been made quite a lot easier. And any webinar worth its salt has at least 2 polls. I've already done one. So I feel like it's a good idea to do another one, but I want to know how many people are using Azure AD Connect Sync in your environment. And I expect this one to be pretty heavily geared in the yes. It's going to be interesting to see if anybody, I got 1 no. But there are other mechanisms to sync, or if you're running cloud only, you could do it that, but it's heavily favored in the yes category. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. In hindsight, that seems like a dumb poll to do, but I felt like I should throw it in there since we're going to talk about Azure AD Connect. So prior to having Azure AD Connect cloud provisioning, organizations would have to establish network connectivity to the other Active Directories and sync them to an intermediary Active Directory forest. And you would do this using something like Microsoft Identity Manager, another IAM platform that can perform sync operations, or some custom script or some sort of custom process. And that custom process could get you around having the network connectivity between the different organizations. So either your organization has to allow some sort of network connectivity between these environments, or you've developed a pretty complicated process in order to facilitate the synchronization to Azure Active Directory. And at Ignite last year, Microsoft released a product called Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning, which isn't exactly in the realm of brevity, but it does have a name, which is specifically tailored to meet the challenges of the scenario that we're looking at. It's very different from Azure AD Connect Sync because it's an agent-based system. And it can be installed on disconnected Active Directory forests, and multiple agents can be installed for high availability. And after the install, the configuration is all done from the Azure portal. This is a pretty radical departure from Azure AD Connect Sync as we know it, which is basically a Microsoft Identity Manager fork. It's basically the same code base of Microsoft Identity Manager, just forked over. But this is a pretty big departure from that framework. So to demonstrate how this works, when I say this, I mean Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning. How it works, I'll set up a scenario which many of you may be familiar with. So I have a company called Oxtoso Health, which is a fictional healthcare company. And it's using Azure AD Connect Sync to provision users, which most of you on this call are currently using. And this sync server is installed on an on-premise server and they're using Azure AD Connect Health to monitor the sync process and remediate any errors that are reported. This is the most common configuration we see in the enterprise today. So, but Oxtoso Health will be acquiring Runner-Up Healthcare and Cyber Health Medicine in a play to hopefully one day remediate those branding mishaps that have plagued both of those organizations. But before that happens, they'll need to enable those users to access resources securely. In order to get those organizations collaborating and accessing applications that are using Azure Active Directory, Oxtoso Health needs to get Runner-Up and Cyber Health identities into their Azure AD. So with the new Azure AD Connect Cloud provisioning, it's going to be installed in each organization without the integration of the networks. So there's no network level integration that had happened between Oxtoso and the other two. And you may have noticed we haven't had to change Oxtoso Health Sync tool. They're still using Azure AD Connect Sync, haven't even had to make any modifications to it. And once the agents are installed, they're going to be configured inside of the Azure portal. So just to show you, it's right here in the Azure AD Connect blade. And right now it still says preview because it's still in preview, but you'll see the link there that says manage provisioning in parentheses preview. And then you'll be presented with the different configuration options where you can configure each one individually. So I've got the two running up there. And then if you were to click on one, that would bring you directly into its configuration section. So you can set up the scope, which can be all users in the Active Directory environment. You can scope it down to organizational units, or you can do it through security groups. And then deployment down there at the bottom can be enabled or disabled. This would allow you to basically scope it down so you could run your tests and then bring it to a larger scope of users by using that scope. We're going to get to this in a little bit, but it only supports password hash sync at the current moment. As far as it can support federation as well, but I just talked about getting rid of Azure AD as our ADFS earlier, so it seems weird to say that, but it can. And then you can change the sync configuration about how we handle attribute transformation. I don't have a great example of that, but that's done actually using through the Graph API. So there's some documentation that gets a little bit down into the weeds for a webinar of this style, but you can change how the sync and attribute transformations by making changes to that through the graph. So you don't have to go into the sync rule editor that you may be familiar with Azure AD Connect, but you do have to make some REST calls to configure that through the Microsoft Graph. So in summary, Azure AD Connect's cloud provisioning allows for the provisioning of identities to Azure AD from disconnected Active Directories. It's not built on Azure AD Connect Sync, so there's no heavyweight server or SQL server that needs to be installed, and the configuration is all done in the Azure portal in the cloud. The last thing I wanted to mention is these agents will auto upgrade, so you don't really have to worry about going to upgrade. They're just going to auto upgrade as Microsoft releases new versions. And to talk about what features aren't available, right? Because this sounds like a dream come true for anybody who's been managing Azure AD Sync servers, and you might have an idea. It's like, well, I can just go replace this with replace my sync box with this. But it's not quite feature parity yet. So there's no support for device objects. There's no customer-defined AD attribute synchronization, otherwise known as extensions. There's no way to filter on the object's attribute values, which we would traditionally call attribute-based filtering. And there's no support for write back of passwords, devices, or groups. The last one there is you can't use it to stand up Azure AD domain services, so you can't leverage that as the backend directory for that simulated directory in the cloud. So when you look at Azure AD Connect cloud provisioning, it might actually be that we are getting a glimpse into Microsoft's world past Azure AD Connect Sync. Really, they just have to make a few enhancements and we might actually be looking at the future replacement for the sync engine that we have today. The sync agent-based tool has several advantages. High availability is one piece that we've been asking for a while, and another is configuring the sync from the Azure AD console. I'm not sure if anyone's ever done this, but a lot of times an administrator will log into the Azure AD sync server, and they'll open up the configuration. They'll get distracted by a ticket being opened up or something happening. They'll leave that console open, and what that does is actually permanently, or not permanently, but it'll, as long as that console window's open, it stops the sync. And so if the administrator got distracted for a long period of time, that sync would remain not running. And I think, you know, when we look at this, I think it's a really good kind of way to envision how this is gonna change how we do sync to Azure AD in the future. But before this webinar comes to an end, I've got one more simple binary poll for you, and that's, would you like to hear more about using Azure AD to securely and efficiently enable mergers and acquisitions for their identity challenges? And I'll fire that off. Thanks for all your responses and attending today's webinar. I hope this was helpful and I was able to provide you with some valuable information. But I hope all of you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.